They say she was one of the most powerful women in history, a queen who ruled an empire, defeated enemies, and shaped the future of a nation. But behind the image of majesty, elegance, and royal perfection, there was a reality so strange, so unsettling, that most history books barely dare to mention it. Because the truth is, the daily life of Elizabeth was not as glamorous as it looked. In fact, some of her personal habits would shock you. And once you understand why she lived this way, you may never look at history the same way again. Because this isn't just a story about a queen. It's a story about a time when even royalty lived in conditions that today would seem almost unimaginable. But no one saw what came next. Because to understand the world of Elizabeth, we must step in the 16th century, a time of power, beauty, danger, and surprisingly poor hygiene. The palaces were magnificent. Towers reached toward the sky. Gold, silk, and jewels surrounded those in power. The court was filled with music, art, and political intrigue. But beneath all that luxury there was something else. Something hidden. Something no one talked about openly. Because cleanliness, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. And what replaced it might disturb you. Everything was about to change. Because during the Tudor era, bathing was not considered essential. In fact, many believed that too much water could actually harm the body. Doctors warned that hot baths could open the pores, allowing disease to enter. So instead of frequent washing, people relied on other methods. Perfume, powder, layers of clothing, but none of these truly solved the problem. They only masked it. And even for a queen, there was no escape. Elizabeth was known for her iconic appearance, her pale face, her elaborate gowns, her carefully styled hair. She was a symbol of power and control. But maintaining that image came with a cost. Because beneath the surface, things were very different. One of the most shocking realities was her bathing routine. Or rather, the lack of it. It is often said that Elizabeth bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. That line, repeated through history, sounds almost humorous. But the truth behind it is far more revealing. Because even that level of bathing was considered unusual for the time. Many people bathed far less frequently. Water was not always clean. Heating it was difficult. And privacy was rare. So instead of regular washing, the focus shifted to appearance. Looking clean became more important than being clean. And that distinction changed everything. But no one saw what came next. Because as Elizabeth grew older, her reliance on cosmetics increased dramatically. Her face became her identity, her power, her shield. She used a white makeup known as Venetian ceruse, a mixture that gave her skin a pale, almost flawless appearance. But there was a problem. It contained lead, a toxic substance. At first, it created the illusion of perfection, smooth skin, even tone, a royal glow. But over time, it began to destroy her skin, causing damage, irritation, and possibly long-term health effects. But she couldn't stop, because the image had to be maintained. Because in a court filled with rivals, perception was everything, and weakness could be dangerous. Everything was about to change, because hygiene was not just about bathing or makeup. It extended to clothing. Elizabeth wore elaborate gowns made of heavy fabrics, silk, velvet, embroidered with gold and jewels. They were stunning, but they were rarely washed. Instead, layers were worn beneath them, linen undergarments that could be changed more frequently. These layers absorbed sweat and oils, protecting the outer garments. But they did not eliminate the issue, because over time odors built up, and in a crowded court where hundreds of people gathered in enclosed spaces, the air itself became heavy, unpleasant, difficult to ignore. But no one spoke of it, because this was normal, because everyone lived this way. But no one saw what came next, because personal hygiene extended even further to dental care, or the lack of it. Elizabeth was known to have severe dental problems, tooth decay, pain, discoloration, and one major reason for this was sugar. At the time, sugar was a luxury, a symbol of wealth, and Elizabeth consumed it frequently. Sweets, candied fruits, sugary treats that were rare for most people but common in the royal court. But there was little understanding of dental hygiene, no modern toothbrushes, no effective treatments, and as a result her teeth suffered. Some accounts suggest that her breath became noticeably unpleasant, so much so that people close to her may have struggled to ignore it. But again, no one dared to speak, because she was the queen, and in her presence a silence was safer than honesty. Everything was about to change, because another hidden aspect of hygiene involved something even more personal: hair. Elizabeth was famous for her red hair, vibrant, striking, unforgettable. But as she aged, she began to lose it, possibly due to illness, or the effects of her cosmetics. So she turned to wigs, elaborate, carefully crafted wigs that restored her image. But these wigs came with their own problems. They were difficult to clean. They could attract lice, and maintaining them required constant attention, because in a world without modern hygiene, even beauty came with risks. But no one saw what came next, because perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all was the environment itself. The palace, a place of power, wealth, and influence, but also a place filled with smells. Waste disposal was primitive. Chamber pots were used, and not always emptied immediately. In large buildings, with many occupants, the accumulation of waste could become overwhelming. And while efforts were made to manage it, they were far from perfect, because the concept of sanitation was still developing, and even the most powerful individuals in the world lived within those limitations. Everything was about to change, because despite all of this, Elizabeth I remained one of the most successful rulers in history. She led England through conflict, strengthened its position in the world, and created a legacy that would endure for centuries. But her daily life tells a different story, a story that reveals the reality behind the image. Because history often shows us the highlights, the victories, the grandeur, but it rarely shows us the details, the uncomfortable truths, the human side of those who shape the world. And those details matter, because they remind us of something important: that power does not make someone immune to the realities of their time. That even a queen lived within the limits of her world, and those limits shaped everything. From how she looked, to how she lived, to how she was remembered. But no one saw what came next, because the world would eventually change. Science would advance, understanding would grow, and hygiene would become something entirely different. But in Elizabeth's time, this was normal. This was life. And this was the reality behind the crown, because when we look at history, we often see perfection. But the truth is far more human, far more flawed, and far more fascinating. Because behind every legend there is a reality, and sometimes that reality is stranger than anything we could imagine. But even that was only the surface of the story. Because what made the world of Elizabeth I truly unsettling was not just what people did, but what they believed. And those beliefs shaped everything, including how they understood cleanliness, disease, and the human body itself. Because in the 16th century, people did not know about bacteria. They did not understand germs. Illness not seen as something microscopic, but something almost mystical. Air could make you sick. Smells could carry disease. This idea, known as miasma, dominated medical thinking for centuries, and it led to one very important conclusion. If bad smells caused illness, then masking those smells could protect you. So instead of removing the source, people covered it. Perfumes became essential. Strong, heavy scents filled rooms, clothing, even bodies. Herbs were carried in small pouches. Flowers were placed in living spaces. Because if you could not eliminate the odor, you could overpower it. But this created a strange illusion. An illusion of cleanliness, an illusion of safety, and for someone like Elizabeth, maintaining that illusion was critical. Because appearance was not just about beauty, it was about power. Everything was about to change, because the Queen's daily routine was built around maintaining control, not just politically, but physically. Every morning, she would be carefully dressed by attendants, layer upon layer of clothing, undergarments, corsets, gowns, jewelry. Each piece serving a purpose, each piece contributing to the image of royalty. But this process was not quick. It could take hours. And during that time, personal hygiene was not the priority. Presentation was, because once she appeared before the court, everything had to be perfect. Every detail, every movement, every expression. Because the court was always watching, and in that world, perception was everything. But no one saw what came next. Because beneath the rituals of dressing and appearance, there were daily realities that no one spoke about: sweat, discomfort, the physical strain of heavy clothing, the effects of limited washing. And over time, these things added up, but they were accepted, because they were normal, because everyone experienced them. But what made Elizabeth's situation unique was the pressure. Because as queen, she could not show weakness. She could not appear flawed. She could not allow the illusion to break. And so, she endured, day after day, year after year, maintaining an image that hid the truth. Everything was about to change. Because one of the most fascinating and disturbing details of her life involved her relationship with illness. Elizabeth lived in a time when disease was everywhere. Outbreaks could spread quickly, and treatments were limited, so prevention became essential. But without modern knowledge, prevention often relied on superstition. Certain foods were avoided, certain practices were followed, and in some cases, extreme measures were taken. It is said that Elizabeth was cautious about her health. She avoided contact with the sick. She maintained strict control over her environment. But even then, there was no guarantee of safety, because disease did not respect status, and even a queen was vulnerable, but no one saw what came next. Because as she aged, the contrast between her public image and her private reality grew stronger. Her face, covered in layers of makeup, remained youthful, but beneath it time was leaving its mark. Wrinkles, skin damage, the long-term effects of lead-based cosmetics. And yet, she continued, because stopping would reveal the truth, and the truth could change everything. Because in a court filled with ambition and competition, any sign of weakness could be exploited. And Elizabeth understood that better than anyone. So she adapted. She controlled what people saw. She controlled what people believed. And in doing so, she controlled her power. But at what cost? Because maintaining that level of control required constant effort, constant attention, constant sacrifice. And over time, it became a burden. But no one saw what came next. Because beyond the queen herself, the entire court reflected these same conditions. Nobles, advisors, servants, all living within the same system, all facing the same limitations. And in such a crowded, enclosed environment, hygiene became a shared challenge. Rooms filled with people, limited ventilation, heavy clothing, strong perfumes masking underlying odors. It created an atmosphere that was far from the elegance we imagine today. But again, it was normal, because no one had experienced anything different. Everything was about to change. Because outside the palace walls, life was even more difficult. Common people faced harsher conditions, less access to resources, fewer options for maintaining cleanliness, and yet, in many ways their lives were not so different from those at the top, because the limitations of the time affected everyone, from the poorest villager to the most powerful queen. And this is what makes the story so powerful, because it reveals something we often forget. That history is not just about events, it is about experiences, daily realities, human conditions, and those conditions shape everything, but no one saw what came next. Because as time moved forward, the world began to change. Slowly, gradually, new ideas emerged, new discoveries were made, understanding began to grow, and with that understanding came transformation. Hygiene improved, medical knowledge advanced, living conditions changed. But during Elizabeth's reign, that future was still far away, and so she lived her life within the limits of her time, adapting, enduring, ruling, and leaving behind a legacy that would outlive her. But that legacy is incomplete, because it often ignores the reality, the human side, the uncomfortable truths, and those truths matter, because they remind us that even the most powerful figures in history were shaped by their environment, by their knowledge, by their limitations. And when we look beyond the image, we see something far more real, far more relatable, because behind the crown was a person living in a world very different from our own, a world where cleanliness was an illusion, where health was uncertain, where appearance masked reality, and where survival required adaptation. But in the end, her story is not just about hygiene. It is about control, about perception, about the lengths people will go to maintain power. Because when everything depends on how you are seen, the truth becomes something you hide, and once the truth is hidden, it becomes something history forgets. Until someone looks closer and asks the question no one else did, what was life really like? And sometimes the answer is far more unsettling than we expect, because the past is not always clean, not always polished, not always perfect, but it is always real, and in that reality we find the truth, A truth that reminds us how far we have come, and how different the world once was.